Young Man Axelbrod, a short story by Sinclair Lewis. The cottonwood is a tree of a slovenly and plebeian habit. Its woolly wisps turn gray the lawns and engender neighborhood hostilities about our town. Yet it is a mighty tree, a refuge and an inspiration. The sun flickers in its towering foliage, whence the tattoo of locusts enlivens our dusty summer afternoons. From the wheat country out to the sagebrush plains between the Buttes and the Yellowstone, it is the cottonwood that keeps a little grateful shade for sweating homesteaders. In Joralemon, we call Knute Axelbrod Old Cottonwood. As a matter of fact, the name was derived not so much from the quality of the man as from the wide grove about his gaunt white house and red barn. He made a comely row of trees on each side of the country road, so that a humble, daily sort of a man driving beneath them in his lumber wagon might fancy himself lord of a private avenue. And at 65, Knute was like one of his own cottonwoods, his roots deep in the soil, his trunk weathered by rain and blizzard and baking August noons, his crown spread to the wide horizon of day and the enormous sky of a prairie night. This immigrant was an American even in speech. Save for a weakness about his J's and W's, he spoke the twangy Yankee English of the land. He was the more American because in his native Scandinavia, he had dreamed of America as a land of light. Always through disillusion and weariness, he beheld America as the world's nursery for justice, for broad, fair towns and eager talk. And always he kept a young soul that dared to desire beauty. As a lad, Knute Axelbrod had wished to be a famous scholar, to learn the ease of foreign tongues, the romance of history, to unfold in the graciousness of wise books. When he first came to America, he worked in a sawmill all day and studied all evening. He mastered enough book learning to teach district school for 2 terms. Then, when he was only 18, a great-hearted pity for faded little Lena Weselius moved him to marry her. Gay enough, doubtless, was their hike by prairie schooner to new farmlands, but Knute was promptly caught in a net of poverty and family. From 18 to 58, he was always snatching children away from death or the farm away from mortgages. He had to be content, and generously content he was, with the second-hand glory of his children's success and, for himself, with pilfered hours of reading. That reading of big, thick, dismal volumes of history and economics which the lone mature learner chooses. Without ever losing his desire for strange cities and the dignity of towers, he stuck to his farm. He acquired a half-section, free from debt, fertile, well-stocked, adorned with a cement silo, a chicken run, a new windmill. He became comfortable, secure, and then he was ready, it seemed, to die, for at 63 his work was done, and he was unneeded and alone. His wife was dead. His sons had scattered afar, one a dentist in Fargo, another a farmer in the Golden Valley. He had turned over his farm to his daughter and son-in-law. They had begged him to live with them, but Knute refused. "No," he said, "you must learn to stand on your own feet. I will not give you the farm. You pay me $400 a year rent, and I live on that and vat you from my hill." On a rise beside the lone cottonwood which he loved best of all his trees, Knute built a tar-paper shack, and here he bached it, cooked his meals, made his bed, sometimes sat in the sun, read many books from the Joralemon library, and began to feel that he was free of the yoke of citizenship which he had borne all his life. For hours at a time, he sat on a backless kitchen chair before the shack, a wide-shouldered man, white-bearded, motionless. A seer despite his grotesquely baggy trousers, his collarless shirt. He looked across the miles of stubble to the steeple of the Jackrabbit Forks Church and meditated upon the uses of life. At first he could not break the rigidity of habit. He rose at 5, found work in cleaning his cabin and cultivating his garden, had dinner exactly at 12, and went to bed by afterglow. But little by little, he discovered that he could be irregular without being arrested. He stayed abed till 7 or even 8. He got a large, deliberate tortoiseshell cat and played games with it, let it lap milk upon the table, called it the princess, and confided to it that he had a sneaking idea that men were fools to work so hard. Around this coatless old man, his stained waistcoat flapping about a huge torso, in a shanty of rumpled bed and pine table covered with sheets of food-daubed newspaper, hovered all the passionate aspiration of youth and the dreams of ancient beauty. He began to take long walks by night. In his necessitous life, night had ever been a period of heavy slumber in close rooms. Now he discovered the mystery of the dark, saw the prairies wide-flung and misty beneath the moon, heard the voices of grass and cottonwoods and drowsy birds. He tramped for miles. His boots were dew-soaked, but he did not heed. He stopped upon hillocks, shyly threw wide his arms, and stood worshipping the naked, slumbering land. These excursions he tried to keep secret, but they were bruited abroad. Neighbors, good, decent fellows with no sense about walking in the dew at night, when they were returning late from town, drunk, lashing their horses and flinging whiskey bottles from racing Democrat wagons, saw him, and they spread the tidings that old Cottonwood was getting nutty since he give up his farm to that son-in-law of his and retired. Seen the old codger wandering around at midnight. Wish I had his chance to sleep. Wouldn't catch me out in the night air. Any rural community from Todd Center to Seringapatam is resentful of any person who varies from its standard and is morbidly fascinated by any hint of madness. The countryside began to spy on Knute Axelbrod, to ask him questions, and to stare from the road at his shack. He was sensitively aware of it and inclined to be surly to inquisitive acquaintances. Doubtless that was the beginning of his great pilgrimage. As a part of the general wild license of his new life, really, he once roared at that startled cat, the princess. By gollies, I ain't gonna brush my teeth tonight. All my life I've brushed 'em, and always wanted to skip a time once. Knute took considerable pleasure in degenerating in his taste and scholarship. He willfully declined to finish The Conquest of Mexico, and began to read light novels borrowed from the Joralemon Library. So he rediscovered the lands of dancing and light wines, which all his life he had desired. Some economics and history he did read, but every evening he would stretch out in his buffalo horn chair, his feet on the cot and the princess in his lap, and invade Zenda or fall in love with Trilby. Among the novels he chanced upon a highly optimistic story of Yale, in which a worthy young man earned his way through college, stroked the crew, won Phi Beta Kappa, and had the most entertaining yet moral conversations on or adjacent to the dear old fence. As a result of this chronicle, at about 3 o'clock one morning, when Knute Axelbrod was 64 years of age, he decided that he would go to college. All his life he had wanted to. Why not do it? When he awoke, he was not so sure about it as when he had gone to sleep. He saw himself as ridiculous, a ponderous, oldish man among clean-limbed youths, like a dusty cottonwood among silver birches. But for months he wrestled and played with that idea of a great pilgrimage to the Mount of Muses. For he really supposed college to be that sort of place. He believed that all college students, except for the wealthy idlers, burned to acquire learning. He pictured Harvard and Yale and Princeton as ancient groves set with marble temples, before which large groups of Grecian youths talked gently about astronomy and good government. In his picture, they never cut classes or ate. With a longing for music and books and graciousness such as the most ambitious boy could never comprehend, this thick-faced farmer dedicated himself to beauty and defied the unconquerable power of approaching old age. He sent for college catalogs and school books and diligently began to prepare himself for college. He found Latin irregular verbs and the whimsicalities of algebra fiendish. They had nothing to do with actual life as he had lived it, but he mastered them. He studied 12 hours a day as once he had plodded through 18 hours a day in the hayfield. With history and English literature, he had comparatively little trouble. Already he knew much of them from his recreative reading. From German neighbors, he had picked up enough Plattdeutsch to make German easy. The trick of study began to come back to him from his small school teaching of 45 years before. He began to believe that he could really put it through. He kept assuring himself that in college, with rare and sympathetic instructors to help him, there would not be this baffling search, this nervous strain. But the unreality of the things he studied did disillusion him, and he tired of his new game. He kept it up chiefly because all his life he had kept up onerous labor without any taste for it. Toward the autumn of the second year of his eccentric life, he no longer believed that he would ever go to college. Then a busy little grocer stopped him on the street in Joralemon and quizzed him about his studies, to the delight of the informal club which always loafs at the corner of the hotel. Knute was silent but dangerously angry. He remembered just in time how he had once laid wrathful hands upon a hired man, and somehow the man's collarbone had been broken. He turned away and walked home, 7 miles, still boiling. He picked up the princess, and with her mewing on his shoulder, tramped out again to enjoy the sunset. He stopped at a reedy slough. He gazed at a hopping plover without seeing it. Suddenly he cried, "I am going to college. It opens next week. I think that I can pass the examinations." 2 days later, he had moved the princess and his sticks of furniture to his son-in-law's house, had bought a new slouch hat, a celluloid collar, and a solemn suit of black, had wrestled with God in prayer through all of a star-clad night, and had taken the train for Minneapolis, on the way to New Haven. While he stared out of the car window, Knute was warning himself that the millionaire's sons would make fun of him. Perhaps they would haze him. He bade himself avoid all these sons of Belial and cleave to his own people, those who earned their way through. At Chicago, he was afraid with a great fear of the lightning flashes that the swift crowds made on his retina, the batteries of ranked motor cars that charged at him. He prayed and ran for his train to New York. He came at last to New Haven. Not with jibing rudeness, but with politely quizzical eyebrows, Yale received him, led him through entrance examinations, which, after sweaty plowing with the pen, he barely passed, and found for him a roommate. The roommate was a large-browed, soft-white grub named Ray Gribble, who had been teaching school in New England and seemed chiefly to desire college training so that he might make more money as a teacher. Ray Gribble was a hustler. He instantly got work tutoring the awkward son of a steelman, and for board he waited on table. He was Knute's chief acquaintance. Knute tried to fool himself into thinking he liked the grub, but Ray couldn't keep his damp hands off the old man's soul. He had the skill of a professional exhorter of young men in finding out Knute's motives, and when he discovered that Knute had a hidden desire to sip at gay, polite literature, Ray said in a shocked way, "Strikes me a man like you, that's getting old, ought to be thinking more about saving your soul than about all these frills. You leave this poetry and stuff to these foreigners and artists, and you stick to Latin and math and the Bible. I tell you, I've taught school, and I've learned by experience." With Ray Gribble, Knute lived grubbily, an existence of torn comforters and smelly lamp, of lexicons and logarithm tables. No leisurely loafing by fireplaces was theirs. They roomed in West Divinity, where gather the theologues, the lesser sort of law students, a whimsical genius or two, and a horde of unplaced freshmen and scrub seniors. Knute was shockingly disappointed, but he stuck to his room because outside of it he was afraid. He was a grotesque figure, and he knew it, a white-polled giant squeezed into a small seat in a classroom, listening to instructors younger than his own sons. Once he tried to sit on the fence. No one but ringers sat on the fence anymore, and at the sight of him trying to look athletic and young, 2 upper-class men snickered, and he sneaked away. He came to hate Ray Gribble and his voluble companions of the submerged 10th of the class, the hewers of tutorial wood. It is doubtless safer to mock the flag than to question that best-established tradition of our democracy, that those who earn their way through college are necessarily stronger, braver, and more assured of success than the weaklings who talk by the fire. Every college story presents such a moral. But tremblingly, the historian submits that Knute discovered that waiting on table did not make lads more heroic than did football or happy loafing. Fine fellows, cheerful and fearless, were many of the boys who earned their way and able to talk to richer classmates without fawning. But just as many of them assumed an abject respectability as the most convenient pose. They were pickers up of unconsidered trifles. They toadied to the classmates whom they tutored. They wriggled before the faculty committee on scholarships. They looked pious at Dwight Hall prayer meetings to make an impression on the serious-minded. And they drank one glass of beer at Jake's to show the light-minded that they meant nothing offensive by their piety. In revenge for cringing to the insolent athletes whom they tutored, they would, when safe among their own kind, yammer about the lack of democracy of college today. Not that they were so indiscreet as to do anything about it. They lacked the stuff of really rebellious souls. Knute listened to them and marveled. They sounded like young hired men talking behind his barn at harvest time. This submerged tenth hated the dilettantes of the class even more than they hated the bloods. Against one Gilbert Washburn, a rich aesthete with more manner than any freshman ought to have, they raged righteously. They spoke of seriousness and industry till Knute, who might once have desired to know lads like Washburn, felt ashamed of himself as a wicked, wasteful old man. Humbly though he sought, he found no inspiration and no comradeship. He was the freak of the class, and aside from the submerged tenth, his classmates were afraid of being queered by being seen with him. As he was still powerful, one who could take up a barrel of pork on his knees, he tried to find friendship among the athletes. He sat at Yale Field, watching the football tryouts, and tried to get acquainted with the candidates. They stared at him and answered his questions grudgingly, beefy youths who in their simple-hearted way showed that they considered him plain crazy. The place itself began to lose the haze of magic through which he had first seen it. Earth is earth, whether one sees it in Camelot or Joralemon or on the Yale campus, or possibly even in the Harvard yard. The buildings ceased to be temples to Knute. They became structures of brick or stone, filled with young men who lounged at windows and watched him amusedly as he tried to slip by. The gargantuan Hall of Commons became a tri-daily horror, because at the table where he dined were two youths who, having uncommonly penetrating minds, discerned that Knute had a beard and courageously told the world about it. One of them, named Atchison, was a superior person, very industrious and scholarly, glib in mathematics and manners. He despised Knute's lack of definite purpose in coming to college. The other was a playboy, a wit and a stealer of street signs, who had a wonderful sense for a subtle jest, and his references to Knute's beard shook the table with jocund mirth 3 times a day. So these youths of gentle birth drove the shambling, wistful old man away from Commons, and thereafter he ate at the lunch counter at the Black Cat. Lacking the stimulus of friendship, it was the harder for Knute to keep up the strain of studying the long assignments. What had been a week's pleasant reading in his shack was now thrown at him as a day's task. But he would not have minded the toil if he could have found one as young as himself. They were all so dreadfully old. The money earners, the serious laborers at athletics, the instructors who worried over their life work of putting marks in class record books. Then, on a sore, bruised day, Knute did meet one who was young. Knute had heard that the professor who was the idol of the college had berated the 2 earnest lads in his Browning class and insisted that they read Alice in Wonderland. Knute floundered dustily about in a second-hand bookshop till he found an Alice, and he brought it home to read over his lunch of a hot dog sandwich. Something in the grave absurdity of the book appealed to him, and he was chuckling over it when Ray Gribble came into the room and glanced at the reader. "Huh," said Mr. Gribble. "That's a fine, funny book," said Knute. "Huh, Alice in Wonderland. I've heard of it. Silly nonsense. Why don't you read something really fine, like Shakespeare or Paradise Lost?" "Well," said Knute, all he could find to say. With Ray Gribble's glassy eye on him, he could no longer roll and roar with the book. He wondered if indeed he ought not to be reading Milton's pompous anthropological misconceptions. He went unhappily out to an early history class. Ably conducted by Blevins, Ph.D. Knute admired Blevins. Ph.D. he was so tubbed and eyeglassed and terribly right. But most of Blevins' lambs did not like Blevins. They said he was a crank. They read newspapers in his class and covertly kicked one another. In the smug, plastered classroom, his arm leaning heavily on the broad tablet arm of his chair, Knute tried not to miss one of Blevins' sardonic proofs that the correct date of the second marriage of Themistocles was 2 years and 7 days later than the date assigned by that illiterate ass, Frutari of Padua. Knute admired young Blevins' performance, and he felt virtuous in application to these hard, unnonsensical facts. He became aware that certain lewd fellows of the lesser sort were playing poker just behind him. His prairie-trained ear caught whispers of two to dole and raise you 2 beans. Knute revolved and frowned upon these mockers of sound learning. As he turned back, he was aware that the offenders were chuckling and continuing their game. He saw that Blevins, Ph.D., perceived that something was wrong. He frowned, but he said nothing. Knute sat in meditation. He saw Blevins as merely a boy. He was sorry for him. He would do the boy a good turn. When class was over, he hung about Blevins' desk till the other students had clattered out. He rumbled, "Say, Professor, you're a fine fellow. I do something for you. If any of the boys make themselves a nuisance, you just call on me, and I spank the son of a guns." Blevins, Ph.D., spake in a manner of culture and nastiness. "Thanks so much, Axelbrod, but I don't fancy that will ever be necessary. I am supposed to be a reasonably good disciplinarian. Good day. Oh, one moment. There's something I've been wishing to speak to you about. I do wish you wouldn't try quite so hard to show off whenever I call on you during quizzes. You answer at such needless length, and you smile as though there were something highly amusing about me. I'm quite willing to have you regard me as a humorous figure, privately, but there are certain classroom conventions, you know, certain little conventions." "Why, Professor," wailed Knute, "I never make fun of you. I didn't know I smile. If I do, I guess it's just because I'm so glad when my stupid old head gets the lesson good." Well, that's very gratifying, I'm sure. And if you will be a little more careful." Blevins, Ph.D., smiled a toothy, frozen smile and trotted off to the graduates' club to be witty about old Knute and his way of saying "just." While in the deserted classroom, Knute sat chill, an old man and doomed. Through the windows came the light of Indian summer. Clean, boyish cries rose from the campus. But the lover of autumn smoothed his baggy sleeve, stared at the blackboard, and there saw only the gray of October stubble about his distant shack. As he pictured the college watching him, secretly making fun of him and his smile, he was now faint and ashamed, now bull-angry. He was lonely for his cat, his fine chair of buffalo horns, the sunny doorstep of his shack, and the understanding land. He had been in college for about 1 month. Before he left the classroom, he stepped behind the instructor's desk and looked at an imaginary class. "I might have stood there as a prof if I could have come earlier," he said softly to himself. Calmed by the liquid autumn gold that flowed through the streets, he walked out Whitney Avenue toward the butte-like hill of East Rock. He observed the caress of the light upon the scarped rock, heard the delicate music of leaves, breathed in air pregnant with tales of old New England. He exulted, "Could write poetry now if I just could write poetry." He climbed to the top of East Rock, whence he could see the Yale buildings like the towers of Oxford and see Long Island Sound and the white glare of Long Island beyond the water. He marveled that Axelbrod of the cottonwood country was looking across an arm of the Atlantic to New York State. He noticed a freshman on a bench at the edge of the rock, and he became irritated. The freshman was Gilbert Washburn, the snob, the dilettante, of whom Ray Gribble had once said, "That guy is the disgrace of the class. He doesn't go out for anything, High Stand or Dwight Hall or anything else. Thinks he's so doggone much better than the rest of the fellows that he doesn't associate with anybody. Thinks he's literary, they say, and yet he doesn't even heel the lit, like the regular literary fellows. Got no time for a loafing, mooning snob like that." As Knute stared at the unaware Gil, whose profile was fine in outline against the sky, he was terrifically public-spirited and disapproving and that sort of moral thing. Though Gil was much too well dressed, he seemed moodily discontented. "What he needs is to vork in a threshing crew and sleep in the hay," grumbled Knute, almost in the virtuous manner of Gribble. "Then he would know when he vas well off and not look like he had the earache." Gil Washburn rose, trailed towards Knute, glanced at him, sat down on Knute's bench. Great view, he said. His smile was eager. That smile symbolized to Knute all the art of life he had come to college to find. He tumbled out of his moral attitude with ludicrous haste, and every wrinkle of his weathered face creased deep as he answered, Yes, I think the Acropolis must be like this here. Say, look here, Axelbrod. I've been thinking about you. Yes? We ought to know each other. We two are the class scandal. We came here to dream, and these busy little goats like Atchison and Giblets, or whatever your roommate's name is, think we're fools not to go out for marks. You may not agree with me, but I've decided that you and I are precisely alike. What makes you think I come here to dream? Bristled Knute. Oh, I used to sit near you at Commons and hear you try to quell old Atchison whenever he got busy discussing the reasons for coming to college. That old moth-eaten topic? I wonder if Cain and Abel didn't discuss it at the Eden Agricultural College. You know, Abel the mark grabber, very pious and high stand, and Cain wanting to read poetry. Yes, said Knute, and I guess, Prof, Adam say, Cain, don't you read this poetry. It won't help you in algebra. Of course. Say, wonder if you'd like to look at this volume of Musset I was sentimental enough to lug up here today. Picked it up when I was abroad last year. From his pocket, Gil drew such a book as Knute had never seen before. A slender volume in a strange language, bound in hand-tooled crushed levant, an effeminate bibelot over which the prairie farmer gasped with luxurious pleasure. The book almost vanished in his big hands. With a timid forefinger, he stroked the levant, ran through the leaves. I can't read it, but that's the kind of book I always thought there must be some like it, he sighed. Listen, cried Gil. Isaiah is playing up at Hartford tonight. Let's go hear him. We'll trolley up. Tried to get some of the fellows to come, but they thought I was a nut. What an Isaiah was, Knute Axelbrod had no notion. But sure, he boomed. When they got to Hartford, they found that between them they had just enough money to get dinner, hear Ysaye from gallery seats, and return only as far as Meriden. At Meriden, Gil suggested, Let's walk back to New Haven then. Can you make it? Knute had no knowledge as to whether it was 4 miles or 40 back to the campus, but, Sure, he said. For the last few months he had been noticing that, despite his bulk, he had to be careful. But tonight he could have flown. In the music of Ysaye, the first real musician he had ever heard, Knute had found all the incredible things of which he had slowly been reading in William Morris and Idylls of the King. Tall knights he had beheld, and slim princesses in white samite, the misty gates of forlorn towns, and the glory of the chivalry that never was. They did walk, roaring down the road beneath the October moon, stopping to steal apples and to exclaim over silvered hills, taking a puerile and very natural joy in chasing a profane dog. It was Gil who talked, and Knute who listened for the most part, but Knute was lured into tales of the pioneer days, of blizzards, of harvesting, and of the first flame of the green wheat. Regarding the Atchisons and Gribbles of the class, both of them were youthfully bitter and supercilious. But they were not bitter long, for they were atavisms tonight. They were wandering minstrels, Gilbert the troubadour with his man-at-arms. They reached the campus at about 5 in the morning. Fumbling for words that would express his feeling, Knute stammered, Well, it was fine. I go to bed now and I dream about... Bed? Rats. Never believe in winding up a party when it's going strong. Too few good parties. Besides, it's only the shank of the evening. Besides, we're hungry. Besides, wait here a second. I'm going up to my room to get some money, and we'll have some eats. Wait, please do. Knute would have waited all night. He had lived almost 70 years and traveled 1,500 miles and endured Ray Gribble to find Gil Washburn. Policemen wondered to see the celluloid-collared old man and the expensive-looking boy rolling arm in arm down Chapel Street in search of a restaurant suitable to poets. They were all closed. The ghetto will be awake by now, said Gil. We'll go buy some eats and take 'em up to my room. I've got some tea there. Knute shouldered through dark streets beside him as naturally as though he had always been a nighthawk, with an aversion to anything as rustic as beds. Down on Oak Street, a place of low shops, smoky lights, and alley mouths, they found the slum already astir. Gil contrived to purchase boxed biscuits, cream cheese, chicken loaf, a bottle of cream. While Gil was chaffering, Knute stared out into the street milkily lighted by wavering gas and the first feebleness of coming day. He gazed upon kosher signs and advertisements in Russian letters, shawled women and bearded rabbis, and as he looked, he gathered contentment which he could never lose. He had traveled abroad tonight. The room of Gil Washburn was all the useless, pleasant things Knute wanted it to be. There was more of Gil's Paris days in it than of his freshmanhood. Persian rugs, a silver tea service, etchings, and books. Knute Axelbrod of the tar paper shack and piggy farmyards gazed in satisfaction. Vast-bearded, sunk in an easy chair, he clucked amiably while Gil lighted a fire. Over supper, they spoke of great men and heroic ideals. It was good talk, and not unspiced with lively references to Gribble and Atchison and Blevins. All asleep now in their correct beds, Gil read snatches of Stevenson and Anatole France. Then, at last, he read his own poetry. It does not matter whether that poetry was good or bad. To Knute, it was a miracle to find one who actually wrote it. The talk grew slow, and they began to yawn. Knute was sensitive to the lowered key of their Indian summer madness, and he hastily rose. As he said goodbye, he felt as though he had but to sleep a little while and return to this unending night of romance. But he came out of the dormitory upon day. It was 6:30 of the morning, with a still, hard light upon red brick walls. "I can go to his room plenty times now. I find my friend," Knute said. He held tight the volume of Musset, which Gil had begged him to take. As he started to walk the few steps to West Divinity, Knute felt very tired. By daylight, the adventure seemed more and more incredible. As he entered the dormitory, he sighed heavily. Age and youth, I guess they can't team together long. As he mounted the stairs, he said, "If I saw the boy again, he would get tired of me. I'd tell him all I got to say." And as he opened his door, he added, "This is what I come to college for, this one night. I go away before I spoil it." He wrote a note to Gil and began to pack his telescope. He did not even wake Ray Gribble, sonorously sleeping in the stale air. At 5 that afternoon, on the day coach of a westbound train, an old man sat smiling. A lasting content was in his eyes, and in his hands a small book in French,